tant que recteur de l'Université d'Ottawa, je voudrais vous souhaiter la bienvenue sur le campus et plus particulièrement à cette discussion importante et fort intéressante cet après-midi. Devant nous, nous avons une discussion au sujet des collaborations entre les ONG et l'industrie minière. Mining companies and NGO partnerships, development or distraction. I'm especially grateful to each of our panelists who have chosen to join us for the discussion this afternoon. And I have to say, just by way of introduction, it's not an easy topic to discuss. There are so many perspectives that must be taken into account. The companies in the mining sector, who often represent some of the only investment and thus the only access to employment in areas outside urban centers across the developing world. Balancing the needs of shareholders, or the demands of shareholders, the needs locally, local cultures, as well as a constantly changing scene in terms of commodity prices, makes it a very difficult mix to manage. NGOs who work with Indigenous peoples to advocate for changes in practice need a forum for discussion with these companies, but must also strike a careful balance between their own independence and access to corporate decision makers who they want to importune to make changes. And although we have chosen to discuss the mining sector and NGO partnerships, there are many other sectors who are struggling with the same issues. The University of Ottawa and the Human Rights Center at our Faculty of Law are delighted to host such a discussion. Indeed, this is one of the central purposes of our university, to provide a safe place to talk about important and complex issues so as to advance understanding on all sides. And I believe that this afternoon provides an opportunity for us to provide information of use to students, researchers, mining companies, and NGOs. So to move things forward, I would like to introduce our moderator this afternoon, Professor Penelope Simons. I'll turn it over to you, and I thank you again for your work in putting this panel together.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you so much for your enthusiastic support of this event. We're very grateful to you for that. This is an important topic, as President Rock mentioned, for all of us in Canada, but also for people at the University of Ottawa. In 2007, a group called the Devonshire Initiative, of which we have a representative here, formed a formal association between mining companies and NGOs to create a forum for discussing the problems facing mining and development, and identifying mutual opportunities and developing sort of innovative on-the-ground collaboration. And among other objectives, the organization seeks to develop a unified, credible voice to speak to other stakeholders, including the Government of Canada. Since that time that this organization has been founded, a number of NGO and mining company partnerships have developed and emerged, including projects that have been funded by the former CIDA, which is now part of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And in January 2011, the University of Ottawa announced that it would house the Devonshire Initiative. So that's why it's important for us to talk about these issues at the University of Ottawa as well as in the greater community. I have representatives here to speak about various perspectives on this issue. So please welcome our four panelists, Ted Thomas, Ben Chalmers, Ian Thompson, and Stephen Brown.
Great, well, thank you very much. Thanks to the University of Ottawa and to President Rock for hosting this meeting today. I think it's a very timely conversation, and I appreciate everyone coming out, notwithstanding the less than ideal weather and the fact that today is a holiday, and I know a lot of folks are not roaming on campus today. So thank you very much. So briefly, within 10 minutes, and this is normally about a half-hour presentation, so I'm going to really condense it down and get to some of the more granular points during our question and answer. A great opportunity to talk about the Devonshire Initiative, which as Penelope mentioned, is housed at the University of Ottawa, although a few minor corrections on it that we'll get to. The DI was founded in 2007 out of the recognition that in Canada we had an ongoing conversation around natural resources and the issue of community development, but that we didn't have a place in Canada where we could have a constructive conversation to allow international NGOs, mining companies, and government to explore some of the intersection between them. It was recognized at that time, and we're continuing to hear this today, of the importance of having an independent, neutral, and non-aligned institution, and there you see hence the desire to have this housed in the university, that could convene a frank and honest dialogue between the different stakeholder families, which traditionally did not have a place to interact with one another. Over the last 6 years since the DI was founded, what we've seen is a quickly growing recognition of the value of dialogue in transforming what was once an unconstructive conversation between different stakeholders into something that's meaningful and pragmatic, and that puts the community-oriented outcomes at the center. Since that time, the DI has grown to be recognized as one of the leading models in the world of engagement between the private sector and the development community. And as President Rock said, a lot of these issues go well beyond just the focus on mining. And I think that's an important point to emphasize. That a lot of what's being discussed strikes at the heart of the role of the private sector in developing countries. Since 2007, the DI has grown to include more than 30 international development and environmental NGOs and companies, roughly proportionally split 50-50 there. And as well, there's ongoing engagement by a variety of different parts of the Government of Canada and international institutions ranging from the UN system to the World Bank. In recent years, we've also seen the DI dialogue build outside of Canada. This is really important to look at engagement with community voices in South America, Southern Africa, and elsewhere, to ensure that the conversations that we're having around mining and development are not just happening here in Ottawa or Toronto or wherever else, but that they're actually happening in the communities that are affected. So just very briefly on what the DI actually does. The DI, as I've mentioned, convenes meaningful and pragmatic dialogue. The purpose behind all of this is to really allow for a focus on collective issues that are of common concern, emphasizing the sharing of knowledge. Oftentimes what we see in this conversation, we had a meeting last week actually that was talking about a completely different industry area, not with mining, and a representative from one of the organizations there made the comment that before they actually had an opportunity to sit down and dialogue, they really believed that their interests did not overlap and were not aligned. But after a period of substantial and hard questions in the dialogue, they realized considerable overlap, and that often sustainable business and sustainable communities go hand in hand are important. These issues through dialogue we seek to explore in Canada with a focus on promoting best practice, building capacity within the development community and the mining community, and looking at supporting the wider objective of building a new culture of collaborative engagement that puts the community at the center. Importantly, though, we really need to emphasize what the DI not only is, but what it is not. A point of correction to what was said in the introduction remarks, the DI is not a formal association, and it is not a partnership between any group. The DI is simply a platform for dialogue and a forum to allow the different stakeholders to come together in a room much like this to have a pragmatic and hard conversation. Equally, the DI is, participation in the DI by any one member does not mean it's an endorsement of another organization at the table. It's actually important to not have a unified voice. The DI does not represent a unified voice on every issue. In a lot of instances, we've actually seen our members take very different perspectives on issues related to the community or related to the governance of natural resources. What's important, though, is that that perspective grew out of informed and pragmatic dialogue. So very briefly, this is a busy slide. I'll touch on just a couple high-level things that we've observed in the last 6 or 7 years of sitting at the middle of a conversation around mining and development. First, many of the challenging socioeconomic issues absolutely require an engagement by all the actors in the community. It's not a lot of issues of poverty and of community empowerment are not going to be addressed simply by one stakeholder. It's imperative that business, civil society, government, and communities all find a way to sit at the table together to discuss their overlapping values and interests, and also to explore those areas of potential conflict and friction. In this respect, it's important. We've seen a lot of discussion around partnerships. It's important to recognize that partnerships are not a substitution, but they're an innovation. There's a range of partnership models out there. A lot of attention is given to partnership models that involve, for example, a movement of financial resources. In fact, what we see is, as partnership models are explored and collaboration is explored in more detail, many models of really transformative and substantial partnership involve simply the coming together around a spirit of dialogue. That's all right. Secondly, what we're seeing is increasingly the leading companies, and occasionally the DI tries to poke its head up above the water and look not only at the mining industry, but take stock of what might be going on in other sectors. This was reflected in a meeting we did earlier last week. What we're seeing is leading companies from across a variety of different industries are redefining the social value of business, both here in Canada as well as in developing countries. And that's one that recognizes the opportunity and the obligation to co-create shared value. Codes, frameworks, audits, mandatory or voluntary, are an important part of this equation, but they're only one part. And really important as well is a place for dialogue to actually talk about how that works on the ground. Third, what's really impressive and continues to strike me is that Canadian organizations, particularly both in the development space as well as environmental NGOs, have a substantial track record of collaboration across sectors here in Canada and internationally. Around the mining industry, for example, there's actually more than 25 years of experience by Canadian development NGOs of working with mining companies to improve the on-the-ground realities in affected communities and to try to really maximize the socioeconomic returns in a sustainable manner. What we see across that conversation is a wide agreement that partnering is not fundraising. The two are very different. Rather, what we see is when organizations are collaborating, they're doing so out of a desire to transform the social value of the private sector into a sustainable and lasting long-term benefit for local, regional, and global communities. To give a really concrete example of what this all means within the context of the DI and a forum, I'm certainly no stranger to the fact that as you go around the world, there's a lot of dialogue happening both in Canada and internationally around mining and development. One very concrete example of what that looks like. In the DI, a number of years ago, and I think this was the proof of concept for us that there was a value in having a place for such conversations in Canada. We had one of the mining company members at the table say to the rest of the group that they were involved in a number of community initiatives at the behest of the community, supporting local economic development opportunities, but that the company principally were made up of engineers, geologists, and folks with business acumen. They did not have the development expertise that you see in a lot of development and environmental NGOs. And so they used the DI as a platform where they could unpack a lot of their experiences with the community in front of a number of NGOs to share on what was going right and maybe what they were missing, maybe what they needed to be doing better on the ground. Really problem-solving oriented conversation that put the community at the forefront of that dialogue. And to make sure that putting the community at the forefront of the dialogue is not just sort of something we say as a nicety. Those conversations included bringing in community representatives in the local context to make sure that really at the end of the day, the impacts of mining in the community were sustainable and respectful of the community's local economic priorities. A lot more to discuss there. I'm going to turn it over to Ben. I'm happy to unpack a little bit more about the DI's work during the Q&A session, which I look forward to.
So I'm from the Mining Association of Canada, and just to begin, maybe a little bit about who we are. We represent the major mining producers across the country, and to a certain extent internationally. We represent from the construction, development, environmental assessment phase of the life cycle through the closure cycle. We also represent the production value chain up to and including smelting and refining. We also represent pretty much all of the major commodities that are mined in Canada with the exception of potash. So our members are diverse. They're the big companies that have mines all over the world. They're the small companies that have maybe one mine. And in some instances, there are companies that don't have a mine yet but are working towards it. Our role is threefold. And I think it's in part because of this threefold role that gives us a unique perspective on the value of partnerships and the place for partnerships. So the threefold role for us is first off, we do advocacy. We work with the government on public policy issues related to mining. The second is we do outreach, public outreach, like I'm doing today with all of you, to share our perspectives on how we mine and why we mine. And then the third part, and the part that I am most focused on, is on our performance. And we work very hard within the industry, within the membership, to drive performance, to improve the way in which we do our activities. And it's where these things come together that I think is in part why I'm here today. I think I wanted to start with sort of recognizing that there is a time for advocacy and there's a time for collaboration and partnerships, and then sometimes those two overlap. And actually, it's quite amazing what you can accomplish on the advocacy side when you do so in partnership. And specifically, I'm here to talk about partnerships today, so I'll try to focus on that. The Mining Association of Canada has quite a lot of history with partnerships. We, as a rule, tend to prefer to work in a multi-stakeholder environment, and I have many instances, and I'll share a few of those, which has led us to believe that this is a very effective way of accomplishing our objectives. But I think what I wanted to say in that is that when we enter into partnerships, one of the primary factors in terms of our decision to do so is really around improving practice and changing the way in which things are done. So I wanted to further that sort of through my comments. And I thought I'd start with this notion of what the partnerships in question are. I'm not going to talk specifically about the kind of partnerships that the Devonshire Initiative is involved in bringing together and being a catalyst for, because that's not exactly the kind of partnerships that the Mining Association itself gets involved in. So I'll give you mostly examples from our own experience, but I think that has a lot of parallels with some of the partnerships between mining companies and NGOs. Generally speaking, I think this is not about offloading our CSR responsibilities to NGOs. When we enter into these partnerships, they are, as I said earlier, about changing practice and helping us either do something differently or tweak our processes and our practices to have a better outcome. And I think specifically one of the things that we've been talking a lot about lately is local procurement. And I think the benefits take a step back. The industry has had practices around procurement for a very long time. And I think in general those practices have not always led to the kind of shared value that Ted was talking about. And I think there's an opportunity for us to work with those expert organizations that have a background in this kind of thing to make modifications to the way in which we and our members do local procurement that can have vastly improved results for communities and can really catalyze the kind of economic benefit that hasn't always been realized in communities. That's just one example of, I think, that I wanted to try to use to illustrate what I'm talking about when this is about changing practice and performance. But I think what's really important to recognize with respect to partnerships is when is the time right? And I'm going to take a little bit of a step back, I think, and talk about where the Mining Association has come over the last few years. We're an organization that's been around for several decades. We've almost exclusively in our history been actively involved and solely involved in mining policy in Canada, domestic mining policy. It's only been in the last 2 years, maybe 2.5, almost 3 years, I guess, that we've started to become involved in this international conversation. And I'm going to, so going back to my first statement about the time for advocacy and time for collaboration, I'll just say that C-300, the debates that came up around the C-300 John McKay's bill were very much a time of advocacy. And it accomplished a certain amount. And I think one of the things that it accomplished is that it woke the industry in Canada up to the need to engage in these issues internationally. Certainly our organization, it caused us to come together and get organized. In that debate, we focused, really, we managed to get ourselves organized to understand that that's not what we wanted, but we couldn't get together and talk about what we did want. And I think in light of that now, we've become organized to start to engage in these issues, and we've done so in collaboration and with other organizations that are trying to, seeking more of those opportunities. But I think what's really important here is that the circumstances need to be right for collaboration. There has to be certain elements in place to move it from a time to advocate to a time to work together and find solutions. One of those circumstances is that it really helps, I think, to find common goals and values. And there's a couple of examples from our own work that I can illustrate that with. A few years ago, we were involved with Nature Canada around the Bathurst Island up north. There was a proposed park, a national park that was going in there, and there was some issues around the park boundary, and there was some issues around existing mining claims. And so Nature Canada came to us and said, would you be interested in working with us to help define where these park boundaries should be? And we said, yes, absolutely, we would be interested in that. I think there's a very strong value of conservation out there that needs to be protected. There was some very important caribou herds in the area, and we wanted to try to find a mutually beneficial solution. So we worked with them, and we were able to negotiate an agreement where the industry gave up several mining claims and were able to establish a boundary that suited everyone's needs in that particular case. Another more recent example, I think, is our work with Publish What You Pay around transparency and around disclosure of payments to governments from extractive activities. Publish What You Pay approached us a year and a half ago and asked us if we would be interested in working on this issue together. And this was an area where we shared a common value, and it really became about how do we do this? What does the final outcome look like? And I think that has been a very powerful partnership that actually led to the Government of Canada changing its position in April and making a commitment to implement transparency around payments in Canada. The second value I think that's really important is, or the second circumstance is really what are the rules of engagement? How do the two organizations work together? And there's many different ways of doing this, and there's many different kinds of rules of engagement. With Publish What You Pay, we set out a very important memorandum of understanding that clearly stated a number of things, including how we communicated publicly, how we would withdraw from the partnership if it didn't work out, and a number of other things. What was important about that is that we never had to come back to that agreement. We laid out the rules at the beginning, and through that I think we developed a certain comfort and even trust with each other. And that was very important. So that's, I think, one of the things that can benefit from laying out those ground rules ahead of time. Sort of a contrasting example is through our Towards Sustainable Mining program, we work with a national advisory panel made up of environmental groups, social groups, labor groups, and a number of others. And we have a separate terms of reference for that group. And what we seek there is not to accomplish a common goal, but we actually want to be challenged. We actually gave a challenge to the facilitator of that organization last year, saying that the conversation is too comfortable. We really want to get into the tough issues. As Ted said, with the Devonshire Initiative, it's about having these tough conversations, and so we wanted rules of engagement that spelled out that we wanted to be challenged. Another one is clear objectives and outcomes. This is another recipe for success, I think, that when you clearly understand what the goal is, that's a very powerful thing to bring together for these partnerships. And a number, I go back to each of the examples that I brought up, but another one is the work we've done with the BC Aboriginal Mine Training Association and other training associations with Aboriginal communities that have come up around Canada. And this is usually partnerships between the federal government, between the provincial government, academic institutions, First Nations communities, and mining companies. And the mining companies come to the table and guarantee jobs. First Nations put forward candidates. The government funds the training program, and the academic institutions deliver. This has become very powerful. Some of the results are very impressive. In every case, I think we've overshot our goals of number of placements. And what's really impressive is that one of the things that you hear about Aboriginal employment in the mining sector that's often cited as a challenge is the retention rate. People don't stick around. And one of the things that we've seen through this partnership is that we have a 95 to 97% retention ratio. And so it's clearly delivered huge benefits to communities and to the companies, and it's done so through partnership. I think the last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of circumstances for success is around the transparency of the process. I think that's critical as well. One of the things that we found very useful with Publish What You Pay is that at every step of the way we posted meeting reports, we posted records of decision, we posted rationale for the kinds of things that we did, and that helped, I think, add credibility to the process. I was challenged the other day, a panel that I spoke at on Friday on this very factor. I was asked what credibility could this framework that we negotiated with Publish What You Pay have, because of the involvement of the industry, is it tainted? And what I said to that individual was, look, everything about this is publicly available. You go on and judge for yourself whether what we've negotiated, what we've developed, is, in your view, a workable solution. And I think that's why transparency around these kind of partnerships is very important. I would leave you with one last thought, and I think that is that these partnerships that have been developed, whether it's the kind of partnerships that I've just spoken about from the Mining Association of Canada's experience, or our members' experience through some of the CIDA partnerships, some of the stuff that Ted's organization helps foster, is that these are typically, as I said at the beginning, about performance. There's very little PR value. Sometimes there is, sometimes there are some reputational benefits. I certainly hope that we are seen now as an association, as a group that can be worked with to accomplish things through our work at Publish What You Pay. But if you look on the web pages of the companies that are involved in these kind of things, it's very hard to find information on these kind of things, because these are really primarily about changing practice and improving the way we do things, not about reputational benefit.
Thank you very much, Ben. Ian.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and for all of you for coming out today. My name is Ian Thompson. I work with Kairos. We're an organization that, well, some say in this town needs no introduction, thanks to our an incident with the Honourable Bev Oda a few years ago, which made Kairos a household name. But I will introduce us all the same. We are an organization of Canadian churches working together for social justice in Canada and internationally. The members of Kairos have a very broad and diverse series of issues, thank you, that bring us together. We work on Aboriginal rights here in Canada and in solidarity with Aboriginal partners here in Canada. We work on international human rights in all corners of the globe with human rights partner organizations. We work on women's rights. We work on peace building. We're actually the ecumenical, the interchurch expression of a great deal of social justice work in Canada, and we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of that work of churches coming together to work on social justice. So I also feel that the work of Kairos, although as an organization we're only just over a decade old, we're part of a long tradition of progressive social justice activism in Canada. I feel a bit funny being in the NGO slot today because we're hearing a lot about mining company NGO partnerships, and we aren't engaged in one. I've actually come here today to tell you a little about Kairos and our decision not to go down this path, not to form partnerships with mining companies. And I think it's a shame that we're not getting the other side of the story. I think I would have really appreciated, and invitations were extended. It's not on the part of the organizers for not having tried hard, but it is unfortunate that we don't have an NGO, a second NGO on the panel who could also share some perspectives about why they are pursuing these partnerships. I think that would really add to today's discussion. Before I tell you what we don't do, let me tell you a little about what we do. One thing that Kairos does is that we do dialogue with the mining industry about issues of concern to our member institutions and our partners globally. So it's not that dialogue is not a part of the way we conduct our work. We were involved in the national roundtables on corporate social responsibility that happened in 2006. That was, I think, a part of the story that was missing about around the time when the Devonshire Initiative was formed. There was a robust and vibrant space for dialogue between the mining industry, civil society, and government. And I think it's you're missing something if you don't mention that as part of how the Devonshire Initiative came to be. There was a consensus between these different stakeholders on a way forward and a series of recommendations that went to government with the support of organizations like Kairos, with the support of organizations like the Mining Association of Canada. So I think we can't leave out the fact that there were vibrant dialogue spaces that predated the creation of the Devonshire Initiative. We chose to focus our energies there, and we continue to dialogue with industry on industry-wide solutions around corporate accountability, and also with particular mining companies to accompany our partners when they want to sit down with a Canadian mining company that may be having an impact in their country. So it's not that dialogue is not a road that we go down. It's a technique that we do use. What we haven't engaged in is a formal partnership with a mining company. And there's a few reasons for that, and I can just give you our experience and our reason that we came to the decision that we came to. That isn't to say that for every organization this applies, but I just kind of want to share a little of what Kairos' experience has been. Our entire program is really based around the concept of partnerships. Partnerships are at the core of the work that Kairos does. And historically, that has been partnerships with our church counterparts in other parts of the world, or with human rights, women's, indigenous, environmental groups in the global south. Those are the partnerships that really form the basis of our work. They guide our work, they help inform our advocacy, they help inform the positions that we take as Canadian churches on issues of public policy in Canada and globally. So those are the partnerships that we hold dearest. They're the longest standing partnerships for us, and they are with the poor and the marginalized people. I mean, there's a reason that Jesus hung out with the poor and the marginalized all the time, and we do use him as our example. And it's true that when we're talking about what sort of partnerships we are seeking out to create a more just world, those are the partnerships that we seek out first. The idea of partnering with large multinational corporations with deep pockets doesn't make sense to the kind of development that we're trying to drive. That's not to say that we can't sit down with multinational corporations. They're very powerful actors in our world and in our economies, and we do have to engage with them. We do have to dialogue with them. But there's a difference between dialogue and entering into a formal partnership, and we can make that distinction. The second consideration, I think, which has been downplayed so far in our conversation, is the financial consideration. Because although it hasn't been mentioned a lot so far, but money is changing hands when we're talking about some of the partnership examples that have been cited. And everybody knows that as a development organization, resources are scarce and are becoming more scarce as government aid budgets are frozen. Costs for all these programs are only going up, and it's a challenge that my organization knows firsthand, having been completely, having our proposal to CIDA approved by CIDA and then turned down by the CIDA minister in that famous insertion of a single word. So we know firsthand what a reduced capacity to do development work looks like. We feel it every day. We are channeling far less support and doing far less programming than we were before that infamous decision was made. And so it's not to say that I don't understand that organizations are facing difficult times, but at the same time, we've weighed the benefits and the risks of entering into these partnerships around the financial reason, and we don't think it makes sense. We don't think that it's a good road to go down. And I do think that for companies, there is real benefit to these partnerships because you're often getting solid advice, decades of experience at NGO rates If you had to pay a consultant to come in and do some of the things that they're getting through these partnerships, you'd be paying top dollar. And there are those consultants out there that are offering those services. It's actually far more lucrative than NGO work for young people at the university looking for a career. Trust me, there's a whole business in consultancy out there, and there's there's something attractive about getting it. What you're getting is a deep expertise at a very good price, and I think that's something that hasn't come out as much. But I don't think we're at the service of our mining sector. We're interested in talking to them about what development looks like and what our partners' concerns are, but we don't see ourselves as looking to serve the mining industry and improve its performance as being one of our primary drivers. I also wonder about the scalability of these partnerships. You can do it as a one-off, but is it really going to be a development driver on a larger scale? Is this really going to be a major trend? Is this really going to be a way that we can drive development? Or are these always going to be side projects? Which brings me to my third and final point, which is about development outcomes, about what's really going to drive change. I think there is potential for the mining sector to drive positive change in developing countries. It's not that it doesn't exist. I think a lot of the partnerships and projects that have been pursued to date are window dressing. They're small potatoes. They're a little sideshow compared to what could really happen if resource revenues were harnessed and driven by the governments and the communities in these countries into real social development. The potential is there. But these partnerships are not getting at how the rules have to change, what structurally has to change, how tax laws have to change. There's so many changes that are needed for mining to become a driver for development. These partnerships aren't really unlocking that potential. And so we've looked at it and we see it as a trend in our sector. We know others are doing it. We as Kairos have chosen not to go down that road. I've named some of the reasons, and I'd be happy to hear your questions and get into a little more back and forth in the discussion. Thank you.
So my name is Stephen Graham, and I'm a professor of political science here at the University of Ottawa. And my primary interest is in foreign aid, and this is sort of my entry point into this topic. And my interest was aroused by these CIDA-funded partnerships between mining companies and NGOs. They were announced in September 2011. I'll use the term CIDA, even though CIDA no longer exists, because everything I'm talking about happened while CIDA existed. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the implications of the merger. So the way I see these partnerships is in a context of commercialization or re-commercialization of Canadian foreign aid. So over the years, Canada and other Western countries have untied their development assistance. So it's no longer required, recipient countries are no longer required to use the foreign aid funds to purchase goods and services in Canada. And it was understood that mixing in our Canadian self-interest into the foreign aid actually led to less effective aid. So we've untied aid, but now we're reintroducing and even celebrating benefits to Canadians and benefits to Canadian private corporations as part of our Canadian foreign aid. So I see this as part also of a top-down desire to rehabilitate the image of the mining community, the mining industry, which has one of the worst corporate industries in the world, and to increase investment opportunities for mining companies, the majority of which around the world have their home base in Canada. Now, the projects that are being funded obviously do help people, they help poor people, and some people say, but it isn't that good enough. And I would argue that no, that just giving $1 million to a family would help some poor people, but that doesn't mean it's an effective use of aid. I would say that in fact these partnerships are an inappropriate use of Canadian foreign aid. So just very quickly, what are the projects? The three projects that were announced in this package, the three partnerships were between Barrick Gold and World Vision working in Peru, IAMGOLD and Plan Canada working in Burkina Faso, and Rio Tinto, Alcan, and WUSC working in Ghana. The first debate that erupted was whether this constituted a subsidy or not. And CIDA was or tried to be very clear on this, Bev Oda, who was minister at the time, said, and this is a direct quote, "In no way are public funds being used to increase the profitability of these companies." And Pierre Graton, who is the president of the Mining Association of Canada, says, "The mining industry does not need nor want subsidies from CIDA." So that's a pretty clear statement from them that it's not about helping Canadian companies. And the government was adamant that this was not a subsidy because none of the funds were going directly to the mining companies, and that's entirely true. The funds were going to the NGOs who were managing the projects. A very important point, though, is that almost all of the development activities from these partnerships are going to mining-affected communities, and more specifically, communities affected by Canadian mining operations. And as most of you probably know, there are many negative effects of mining. A lot of them are environmental, often human rights abuses and all sorts of other problems. And if you want more information on that, there's some folks from Mining Watch Canada over there, and their website is great for looking up that kind of information. I'm not going to go into detail about that. Pierre Graton, the Mining Association of Canada president, as I mentioned, said that such endeavors, quote, "make it easier for mining firms to sell their sometimes controversial projects to local populations," end of quote. So here the story is a little bit different. So here are public funds, public Canadian funds, helping a private company sell their controversial projects to local populations. One thing that we haven't really heard about is that very often local communities don't want mines. There are protests, there's a lot of conflict, sometimes violence associated with plans to set up a mine, or in fact after mines are operational. Julian Fantino, when he was Minister of International Cooperation, said CIDA's work with mining companies would help them compete on the international stage. So we've got the government and the mining association saying it's to help them compete. To me, that would be evidence of an indirect subsidy. Because if public funds are going to help a private company compete, that's a subsidy. In the business, this is often called a social license to operate, which means buying and maintaining the consent of a community to operate there. Some people who are more critical will call it pacification, so buying off communities. Okay. So why is the government setting aside resources and allocating them to these projects, particularly at a time when the government is reducing its overall aid budget and also reducing its budget to support NGOs that aren't working with mining companies? I tried to explore the rationales behind this, and I find it incredibly confusing. The government initially pitched this as support to corporate social responsibility, to CSR, but that seems like a bit of an oxymoron if you're using public funds for corporate social responsibility. And in one of these three projects, the mining company was actually only paying 13% of the cost of the project. CIDA was paying 75%, and the NGO was paying 12%. So many of the mining companies and NGOs involved are actually really uncomfortable with this term, CSR. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up. So, why are they doing it? Mining Association of Canada, Pierre Graton, said the companies needed CIDA funding to access NGO expertise. That made no sense to me because, as Ian has mentioned, they can hire consultants. Graton also said that they needed to be held accountable for their development projects. And this seemed a bit odd because why do you need CIDA to hold you accountable? And it seemed like an admission that there was an accountability problem. And this actually seemed unwise to raise that word because Ben mentioned Bill C-300, which would have introduced mandatory accountability for the mining sector, for the extractive sector, and the industry resisted it very, very strongly. Bev Oda and other officials said that this is about better development assistance. This is a new way of doing foreign aid. She said it's another way of improving the effectiveness of CIDA's work. But then Graton said, we're miners, we're not in the business of social and community development that NGOs are expert at. What's very clear here, if you look at the projects, is that there's no actual difference in these projects from regular projects. There's no value added of having private sector expertise, despite what government people are saying. I've talked to the mining companies, they say, well, they're involved in some of the discussions and they do some monitoring, but these are traditional aid projects. They're not new 21st century, new way of doing things. It's the same kind of thing that we've been doing for a very long time. CIDA also said that it's about resource mobilization, getting new funds. If that is true, then CIDA is really selling itself cheap, because in some cases there's only $300,000 that the mining company is kicking in. And it doesn't explain why is it only from mining companies, why is it only from Canadian mining companies, why is it not from Tim Hortons or RBC or Chinese mining company. So that sort of reinforces the idea that there actually is benefit to the Canadian mining company. So none of these explanations are convincing. Clearly there are lots of benefits, well, there are some benefits for several of the actors. The NGOs access additional funds, they get to scale up their operations. They say that they will help improve corporate practice. One of them said, we are working, or the three heads of the three NGOs published a piece in the newspaper saying that they are working diligently to mitigate and prevent harm, but that's magical thinking, because there's no content in these projects that actually helps improve practices. So Ben mentioned changing practices. Nothing about these partnerships that are funded by CIDA do anything to change corporate practices around mining. They actually deflect attention away from accountability for the Canadian corporate malpractice. And many people would argue that in that way they actually, they facilitate harm, because they're deflecting attention from accountability for malpractice and helping the industry reinvent itself as a charitable actor, bringing attention to their side projects, the side shows that Ian mentioned. Now, Rosemary McCartney, president of Plan Canada, which is one of the three NGOs, has stated that accepting money from IAMGOLD would not prevent her organization from criticizing it. And she said on the radio, no partnership would keep us from speaking out when we see abuses or bad practices. And she added, quote, shame on us if it would silence us that way. I had a look at the project implementation plan. It makes it pretty clear that the NGO would refrain from commenting publicly on any allegations regarding IAMGOLD's mining practices, and it foresees actually helping the company do damage control, managing public relations problems in case of a public outcry. The mining companies are in favor of these partnerships because CIDA funding helps them scale up their CSR programs. And it helps convince, as I said earlier, local communities to welcome mining operations, and specifically Canadian ones, with the promise that Canadian government and Canadian NGOs will provide sweeteners if they allow a Canadian mining company into their community. For CIDA and the Canadian government more broadly, I'd say that the reasons are more commercial and ideological. They have a non-critical pro-business stance towards across various areas of activity, not just foreign aid, in favor of the widely criticized extractive industry. Oda said there's nothing wrong with the private sector, and particularly our private sector. They're responsible, they're good. Fantino said Canadian companies have shown themselves to be socially responsible, and he added, most importantly, this has contributed to their bottom line. Think of SNC-Lavalin, which tops the World Bank list of companies that have been barred from competing for World Bank contracts, and they're now barred from competing from CIDA contracts because of corruption. Barrick Gold is on the top 10 corporate criminal list of an American NGO. RepRisk, which does risk analysis of all companies, not just in the extractive sector, put among their top 10 two out of these three companies that CIDA is partnering with. We've seen a return to self-interest. So Fantino said we have a duty and a responsibility to ensure that Canadian interests are promoted by Canadian foreign aid. And he said that Canadians are entitled to derive a benefit. At the Board of Directors meeting of the Mining Association of Canada, he said, we want to help you succeed. A reminder, Fantino was Minister for International Development, not Minister of Industry. What are the risks? For the NGOs, it's reputational. Ian has mentioned that. Not just for those three NGOs, though, but for the NGO sector as a whole. This controversy is, okay, I'm going to have to I'll do something very quickly, and then I'll give you keywords on what you can ask me a question. So the risk for the NGOs, it's reputational for the three, but also for the sector as a whole. If you talk to the people from the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, who are sitting in the third world, they can tell you how divisive it's been for their membership. And it's part of a bigger divide between NGOs that are more interested in getting money for service delivery and those who actually want to do advocacy and change things. For CIDA, there's a reputational risk and in their choice of partners. There are not many risks to the companies other than unwanted attention. And in fact, that's why they want to keep a low profile, and that's why a lot of them were upset that CIDA made a big deal of this, because if CIDA hadn't, I wouldn't even be talking about this today. So my key words for the conclusion, if you want to ask me a question. If we want to help people in communities, we should do it where the need is greatest, not just where Canadian mining companies are operating. I will skip that. That's just summing up. Okay. You can ask me about other forms of support to NGOs that go beyond these 3 partnerships. You can ask me about the merger and what it means for the future of this kind of partnership. And you can ask me about the concept of conflict of interest. So.
So I'm going to give each of the panel members 2 minutes to reply. But
I think I might zone in on just one point that we saw particularly early on in conversations within the rubric of the DI. And in fact, Ian was quite right. The CSR roundtables that he described that happened in 2006 and 2007 were a precursor to that, and I think reflected the degree to which conversation around mining and development was happening in Canada and internationally, and continues to do so. The point of correction there, though, is that what the DI represented was an ongoing institutionalized place for these conversations to keep happening, whereas the CSR roundtables had an expiry date on the end of them as they were a consultation process. I think the important thing, and this is when you really get into the granular details of this, what comes out is that a one-size-fit-all approach does not work. We've certainly heard within our conversations in the DI of a lot of places that are not appropriate to partner. Either the company is not the right partner, or the NGO is not the right partner, or there's something going on in the country, or what have you. Or there's instances where it does make sense to work together. But working together also is a very broad concept. There's, within our members, when I think of the sort of list of collaborative experiences that we've unpacked and had conversations about, most of them do not involve a transfer of money from a company to an NGO. Oftentimes it's another form of engagement. One in particular, as an illustrative example, is a company and an NGO working together to develop a toolkit that would reach out to 2,000 other companies to try to improve their on-the-ground engagement with the community. And in that case, there was no transfer of funds between either of the organizations. It was leveraging the skills and the knowledge on the ground that the NGO and that the industry both had separately. At the end of the day, I think what's important, and we've heard this from across the panel, is dialogue. It's important to at least have a place to come together and look at what the issues on the table are and be able to challenge each other and maybe try to push the boundaries a little bit. There's a lot of examples. Bill C-300 is a good one where not everyone walks away with the same opinion, but at least it's a meaningful and engaged conversation as opposed to what you might get if you don't have that space to talk, if you're simply going off of what you read on a website, for example. I'll pass it over and look forward to the Q&A.
It's interesting to hear the debate around Bill C-300 where everybody goes off with different viewpoints. I mean, to me, that's a debate in the public square. That engaged Canadians. That was a debate about what we want our country to be about, what we want our economy to be about, what we want our companies held to as far as expectations. That is the kind of debate that Kairos and several other NGOs and several other mining companies want to engage in. I was really impressed that you brought up transparency, Ben, because I do think that's an important value in partnerships, and that I think was one of the problems that the Devonshire Initiative was formed at a time with very little transparency. It was hatched in the Peter Monk School at the University of Toronto. It has the name Devonshire because that's the street on which the Peter Monk School for Global Affairs is located. There was not a broad outreach process to get a debate going between companies and NGOs when it was formed. There was a distinct lack of transparency. And I think that I'm very happy that the University of Ottawa is hosting this dialogue. And thank you, President Rock, for convening and sponsoring this. I do think it does have to get out in the open. I think it's telling that no Canadian NGO who's engaged in a partnership with a mining company wanted to come up in front of an audience and talk about it. That is not transparency. And that's what we need if these partnerships are going to have credibility in Canada or in the South where they're actually engaging in these projects.
I think I want to just pick up on the point that was made that this is an either-or, that these kind of partnerships are distractions from accountability. I think what is needed here to improve the development objectives and development outcomes and the practice of the industry and achieve shared value in the communities is a toolkit. And these kind of partnerships, the kind of partnerships that the Devonshire Initiative is involved in fostering as a piece of that. I think the kind of partnerships that I talked about that the Mining Association is involved in, like the work with Publish What You Pay, is a piece of that. Accountability mechanisms are a piece of that, whether it be mediation through the CSR counselor or the NCP or the courts or other mechanisms. I think development objectives can be achieved at small scale and at the large scale. And I think if you talk to someone going through a training program that's a result of a partnership, whether it's through the BC Aboriginal Mine Training Association or the training school created by Plan and I Am Gold in Burkina Faso, I think those individuals would tell you that they're good things and that their lives are hopefully better off for that training. I also wanted to just point out that I think to characterize these partnerships as being only benefiting mine site communities mining affected communities is not accurate. I think if you look at the school in Burkina Faso, this is 700 kilometers away from the mine site. The mine may or may not realize, they may not see any of these individuals employed at their mine because of the distance, but these individuals are leaving with real skills that can benefit themselves and their communities through trades. In the case of Rio Tinto in Ghana, the Rio Tinto is not even involved in Ghana anymore. They remained committed after they left the country. So I just wanted to put that in perspective, and I'll pass it on to Steve.
Okay, I'd like to start by just addressing the last 2 points. It's true that the I Am Gold Plan Canada does not directly benefit mining affected communities or the mining companies, but that's only one out of the 3. The CIDA press release actually says that it trains workers to work in the mines, and that was probably a mistake by CIDA saying that. The Globe and Mail said that there would also be 500 internships with the mining company, but this is something denied by the mining company itself and the NGO involved. So if one of them is not directly affecting mining communities, it's that one. The fact that Rio Tinto, after agreeing to do this, left the country has to do with the business decision to sell their mine to a Chinese mining company. When they signed on, it would have benefited that. That was the plan. So I don't think it invalidates the argument that it's about affecting mining communities. So let me get to 3 points that I didn't have time to get to. The first one was that CIDA's activities are not limited to these 3 projects that I'm talking about. There's a much larger $25 million center set up at UBC that's meant to promote this kind of work. There was $20 million put into an Andean initiative that funds sort of micro projects. Care Canada is a 4th NGO that's benefiting through that, and very little information is available publicly. You can go to the CIDA browser, but it's very, very limited. So there's a fundamental lack of transparency there. Some of the documents that I cited today I had to get through access to information. One of my requests has been outstanding for a year and a half. So the government has not been very transparent about that. CIDA also funds other NGOs, including NGOs that have been set up by the mining industry, like the Lundin Foundation. They got sorry, that's the extractive industry. They do mostly oil. They got $4.5 million in 2011 just by setting up an NGO and having it apply. They got another $2.8 million in 2012 for working with Engineers Without Borders. CIDA also has, DFATE gave money also to a Quebec-based mining company to do social development in lots of West Africa. So there are all sorts of other forms. Conflict of interest. A couple of authors have used this term when discussing Canada's role. Basically, Canada is promoting the idea that mining is a great way to develop. Telling all countries around the world you should develop your natural resource extraction, despite the fact that so many economists talk about the natural resource curse and evidence that countries don't necessarily, or often have a lower growth rate when they're exploiting natural resources, that even the World Bank recognizes that the jobs that are created are very often temporary, and because of mechanization there are not necessarily that many. But Canada has powerful interests in advocating for an investment in the mining industry, but it's using foreign aid funds to promote it. So that's the idea of conflict of interest. Foreign aid funds are legally committed for poverty alleviation. Canada has lots of other instruments that it can use and does use, like in DFATE itself, under Foreign Affairs or under Trade, the Export Development Corporation, the Canadian, the CCC. My critique here focuses on the use of foreign aid funds. My last point is about CIDA's absorption into DFATE, into the new DFAT-D, which sounds like an overweight rapper or something, but I think this will increase pressure for using foreign aid funds to promote Canadian commercial interests. I think that warrants close monitoring. It's very interesting, the 5-person advisory committee on the merger includes the CEO of Rio Tinto Alcan. I think that's very telling. And finally, what used to be partnerships for development, so partnerships with Canadian branch at CIDA, under the new DFAT-D organigram has been renamed Partnerships for Development Innovation. And as many of you might know, innovation is code for private sector, and it's been confirmed to me from somebody within that they're going to be very interested in working with the private sector with the pool of money that used to go mainly to Canadian NGOs. So this is something to keep an eye on.
Well, thank you very much to all of the panelists for their